the state bank. The update in Vermont is that Hinda Miller has submitted a request for a bill to Legislative Council. And I have not had the privilege of seeing the raw material, but I think Gary...
Well, we gave it to her.
Gary is the one who gave her the raw material. So I guess I've seen it one way or another. But I haven't seen specifically what she gave to Legislative Council. But the bill is in the works. I have asked her to allow Gary and John and myself to put in our 2 cents as the bill moves along. But I haven't heard back from her since I did that. So I don't know what's up. California.
Jim's thirsty, your eyes.
You step out of the light.
It's not hurting my eyes, but if it's hurting your eyes, let me
Oh,
know.
I'll give my side.
Okay.
There, thank you.
That's
Thank you.
better.
All right. California devised a system of warrants, which John Ford knows quite a bit about and can explain it later, which is essentially put money into circulation to tide it over for a period. I mention that because it passed constitutional muster, for those who are whining about that problem. Massachusetts is investigating a state bank. And, of course, North Dakota has had one since 1920.
11.
Well, they started the process in 1911. They haven't had the bank since 1920.
Sorry.
Tried to fool me on that one, didn't you? So that's kind of the progress that roughly that's going on from one state to another. New Mexico has a move in progress to pull the money out of Wall Street. I think that's actually, having spoken with Jeb Spalding and looked at things, that's actually a little bit more complicated than it sounds, but it certainly can be done. Now, what I want to do is just give you a few sentences of what I gave to Jeb Spalding, because I want you to know what Jeb Spalding knows, assuming he can read. And this is on my blog, so all you have to do is go to my blog at Vermont Commons and read the whole thing, but I want to give you a synopsis of it. I said to him, the principle at work regarding a state bank is that you have a mechanism for creating money, spending money, borrowing money from the bank itself, which is circular back into the state, and lending money without any of that money being owed to the central banks or to the world at large. Right now, when Vermont floats a bond, it can be bought by anybody, anywhere, and they actually owe that money out of state and the interest on the bond out of state. If the only people who bought bonds were those state bonds were Vermonters, that'd be another issue. But anyway, moving right along to the world at large. It would reverse, a state bank would reverse the outgoing cash flow of interest and provide funds for needed state projects. So in North Dakota, the money circulates through the state. They never float a bond to the world at large, so they never owe money out of state, and they don't have to borrow money. Debt owed to the Fed is inflationary and unproductive because at its best it is chasing growth, and at its worst is just a Ponzi scheme controlled by the criminals who set it in motion. We hope to dispel the myth that money spent into circulation by governments, as opposed to being lent into circulation by banks, is in itself inflationary. I'll say the meat of that again. We hope to dispel the myth that money spent into circulation by governments is in itself inflationary. Benjamin Franklin was right, North Dakota is right, Guernsey is right, Japan is right, China is right, Argentina is right. The times demand state currencies that don't float like bait for international speculation and for control by the IMF. International currencies like the dollar are used for international transactions. Sovereign state currencies can be used for in-state transactions. Now I'm segueing here into the concept of a complementary currency. Essentially, that's what Japan works from, and I'll explain that quickly. Japan has a debt, something like 4 times what the US is, but it doesn't matter. And it's not inflationary. So all the gold bugs, all the people who are panicking about inflation, look at Japan, because as long as it circulates throughout the country and is used for productive purposes, and when I say productive, I mean productive, when it's used for productive purposes, it cannot be inflationary. That's what Benjamin Franklin figured out, and it worked beautifully until the Brits counterfeited it and put gazillions of dollars into the system and tried to shut it down. So that's, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to get Jeb Spaulding to understand about state banks. And I sent this to Hinda Miller as well. Now, what Ellen Brown has to say about it is this, and I gave this to Jeb Spaulding as well. One problem with the current system, I'm paraphrasing this, is that the government itself has been seduced into borrowing money created out of nothing and paying interest on it, when the government could have created the funds itself, debt and interest-free. In the case of government loans, the banks take virtually no risk, since the government is always good for interest. That's because we live in an essentially, by definition, slave society, indentured servitude society, in which they can put you in jail if you don't cough up the money. And the taxpayers get saddled with a crippling debt that could have been avoided. At some point, the interest bill alone must exceed the taxpayer's ability to pay it. And according to U.S. Comptroller General David Walker, the day of reckoning is only a few years away. We have reached the end of the line of the debt money train, and will have to consider some sort of paradigm shift if the economy is to survive. And here's another quote that I'm paraphrasing, which should wrap it all up beautifully. The whole concept of Benjamin Franklin's idea is beautifully summed up here. In 1853, under the auspices of Abraham Lincoln and Henry Carey, in an effort to escape the clutches of the British, who had, quote, ruined Ireland and India, and are now poisoning and enslaving the Chinese people, Lincoln and Carey issued greenbacks in order to prevent the American populace from falling into that trap. Lincoln and Carey issued greenbacks, as you probably know. America had narrowly escaped the fate of the Irish, Indians, and Chinese only because Lincoln had stood up to the bankers, rejecting their usurious loans in favor of government-issued greenbacks. He had sponsored a government program in which the country would convert its own raw materials into manufactured goods, funding its own internal development by generating its own money, avoiding interest payments, and subservience to middlemen, foreign and domestic. And guess what? The Brits said the exact same thing about that as they said about Benjamin Franklin's currency. They said, if Lincoln's greenback plan were not destroyed, that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without a debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the civilized world. God forbid. That's the goal of the central banks, is to keep that from happening. Because what if it happens? Where do they get their billions? Where do they get their trillions of payoffs if they're not even in the picture? And it can only start with the states. There's no way in hell the federal government, which is owned by the banks, and now it's not just owned by them, it's run by them. So there's no way those people like Zarlenga, those people who are looking, even Ron Paul, I think it's an incredibly wonderful thing that he's doing, but it's not going to work because the government is run by the banks. So I hope Ron Paul keeps at it, because it will wake people up to the fact that they've got to do it at the state level. So that's where we're at right now with the need, and what we really need to do is form a public bank in the state of Vermont. So I'll take some quick questions from that, and I have another 15 minutes later, right, about currency?
Yes.
Okay, so I want Garrett, yeah. Go ahead.